Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express. And as always, I hope you enjoy the journey ahead. When US forces captured Nicolás Maduro in a matter of hours, the shockwaves didn't stop in Caracas. They traveled straight to the Kremlin, where silence spoke louder than any condemnation. Russia protested diplomatically, but militarily, nothing. And that absence told the world something Moscow would rather keep hidden. Because to Vladimir Putin, this operation in Venezuela was about power, credibility, and what happens when one authoritarian regime discovers that its protector no longer is actually capable or even willing to protect it. On this episode, we're looking into where Russia's allegiances lie and where they lie dead. Let's take a look at that latest report to find out more.
The United States' ousting from power of Venezuelan autocrat Nicolás Maduro prompted a mixed response internationally about the intervention. While some countries welcomed Maduro's capture, others labeled it an attack on Venezuela's sovereignty, with Russia being among the states who have officially decried the attack. The Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs has said that the American pretext for the action, an indictment by a grand jury in New York on charges of narco-terrorism against the United States, is unfounded. The Kremlin has also called for Maduro's release and in the meantime backed Venezuela's interim leader, Delcy Rodriguez. Yet despite its self-serving reference to the sovereignty of nations and respect for international law, critics note that Russia has taken a relatively measured diplomatic approach to the United States' intervention. Beyond expressing its outrage, Moscow's defiance to the Trump administration is seemingly limited. Analysts say that this is because of the Kremlin's desire not to sour relations with Donald Trump, who has warmed to Russia while seeking to broker a negotiated settlement for the war in Ukraine. Moreover, with heavy state resources directed to the Ukrainian frontline, critics question Russia's ability to support the Venezuelan government militarily. Sending military resources may be impractical for a nation engulfed in a full-scale war against its neighbor. Moscow's condemnation of the United States, paired with limited practical action, paints a picture of a government that is politically in over its head. While battle rages on in Ukraine, the Kremlin is unlikely to expend highly sought-after resources or risk provoking the United States over Venezuela.
And now we're zoning in on the explaining portion of our show. Russia's attitude towards Venezuela has long been pragmatic, with Moscow using the resource-rich state as a bargaining chip. The US ousting of Nicolás Maduro, however, has tested the limits of Russia's supposed friendship with Venezuela. Let's take a closer look.
In a 2019 congressional hearing, former advisor to President Trump, Fiona Hill, said Russian officials made an informal proposal to approve U.S. efforts to pursue its own interests in Venezuela in return for Moscow being allowed to do the same with Ukraine. This came despite Russia having long supplied arms to Venezuela in exchange for access to the country's vast natural resources. According to Hill, the Kremlin understood that Washington viewed Venezuela as strategically important and, as such, expressed its willingness for the United States to assume greater influence in the region. That proposal was rejected. Now, nearly 7 years later, the second Trump administration is forcibly exerting its influence and demanding that Venezuela cut its economic ties with Russia. While recent Kremlin rhetoric denounces U.S. intervention, Russia's supposedly principled stance on Venezuela's sovereignty appears shallow and insincere. From its 2019 proposal to Washington to its current response to U.S. involvement, one thing is clear: Moscow's willingness to turn its back on Venezuela is nothing new.
And now we're zooming in on Caracas and Moscow to examine the issue in greater detail. The Maduro regime in Venezuela wasn't just another distant partner. It was one of Russia's last ideological footholds in the Western Hemisphere, a regime Moscow had invested in politically, militarily, and financially for nearly 2 decades. Not to mention that this situation creates a paradox Putin knows all too well. On one hand, the Kremlin can exploit the optics. Russian propaganda immediately framed the operation as proof that the West's talk of rules and sovereignty is conditional, selective, and ultimately disposable. If Washington can kidnap a foreign head of state, why would Russia apologize for Ukraine? In the global South, this narrative actually lands. Anti-colonial language remains one of Moscow's most effective rhetorical weapons, even when wielded by a former empire with nuclear weapons. But on the other hand, Venezuela exposed something far more dangerous for Moscow. Russia cannot protect its friends. And this isn't new either. Syria already showed the limits of Russian power when Bashar al-Assad had to be rescued diplomatically rather than militarily. Iran has learned that Russian backing comes with caveats and very extensive delays. Now Venezuela joins the list. Moscow promises loyalty, sells weapons, signs energy deals, but when push comes to shove, it blinks. The economic angle only deepens the wound. Venezuela's oil sector was supposed to be part of Russia's long game, shared projects, debt repayments, and coordination with other sanctioned producers to manage supply. If the United States succeeds in reviving Venezuelan production, global prices drop and Russia bleeds. All revenue remains the Kremlin's financial spine, propping up the war economy and cushioning sanctions. Anything that undermines it strikes at the heart of Putin's resilience strategy. Still, Putin is not panicking because he doesn't need to. Nuclear weapons redraw the rules. They guarantee that what happened in Caracas will not happen in Moscow. That reality reassures the Kremlin and terrifies everyone else. If Maduro's fate teaches dictators anything, it's that survival now depends less on loyalty and more on deterrence. So yes, Venezuela is a double-edged sword for Putin. It damages Russia's prestige, undermines its economic interests, and exposes its strategic limits. But it also hands Moscow propaganda ammunition and ideological cover, especially if Washington repeats this model elsewhere. President Vladimir Zelensky made a remark after the capture of the Venezuelan dictator that maybe now it's time to focus on the despot in Moscow. For Ukraine, the contrast is brutal, and despite his humor, Zelensky knows that Moscow is not Caracas and Putin is not Maduro. Power intervenes where it can, not where it should. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Joanna Gosłowska-Bolek, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Warsaw. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Hello, thank you for inviting me.
So looking at the situation with Venezuela, do you think it's all doom and gloom for Vladimir Putin, or is there a silver lining to this story insofar as Russia is concerned?
Probably it will change a lot. All these events around Venezuela, and especially the capture of Nicolás Maduro, is an important signal for other countries, and especially like Russia, China, Iran, that have been allies of Venezuela. And Russia and Venezuela's relationship lasted for years. And Venezuela used to be one of the most important Russian allies in Latin America, apart from Cuba and Nicaragua. Now it will probably change. It will be stopped by all these events and by the relationship of U.S. administration towards Latin American countries. So from Moscow's perspective, its policy toward Venezuela used to carry a dual strategic logic. First, to establish forward base of influence in Latin America, in the Western Hemisphere, as a counterweight to US military dominance. And second, to secure access to Venezuela's vast oil reserves, oil and gas reserves as part of Russia's global energy network. So both these perspectives just stopped with these events that we observed last week in Venezuela.
So isn't this a bit of a disaster in terms of Russia's image? I mean, any country will now look upon this and say, okay, so what is the benefit of being an ally of Russia? If Russia, being your stronger ally, will do literally nothing if you're in trouble. And it's not the first time that it happened. I mean, Armenia complained about Russia not helping them with Azerbaijan. And later on, we had the toppling of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. And in that case, also, Russia hardly did anything to stop that. So would you say that this pattern will hurt Russia in the long term, Russia's credibility in this regard?
Probably yes, because Russia has been present in Latin America for years, especially in this military and energy sense. And Venezuela has also been the strongest, the most important ally, and we could observe also the. Strong Russian investments and Russian exports, arms exports to Venezuela that increased significantly since the beginning of the Hugo Chavez presidency at the beginning of this century. So totally until the era of Nicolás Maduro, approximately $15 billion was the arm exports to Venezuela. So including fighters, helicopters, tanks, self-propelled artillery, everything. All these defense systems we could observe did not played any role during this military attack or capture of the Nicolás Maduro, so the leader of Venezuela, last week. It did nothing.
No, indeed, and some of them were even destroyed. That's another blow to Russia's reputation. But I've got one question. Some people say Russia actually allowed this to happen. It's not like it couldn't do anything, although its abilities were kind of limited anyway, but that Russia will still have an influence through the country's military, and that Putin himself didn't even value Maduro personally that much. He considered him to be a bit of a grotesque character, not really that reliable, so that he, if not, if it wasn't a deal that was struck with anyone, at least allowed this to happen. Maduro is out, but we, the Russians, will still try to meddle through the country's military, which after all, they are the kingmakers. They were during the times of Hugo Chavez, and they will be now. Do you think this is a sound calculation, if there is one, on the part of the Kremlin?
There are some comments. We still don't know if credible or not, because there is no further documentary on this. But in 2019, so a few years ago, there was a kind of deal between the US and Russia about Ukraine and Venezuela. So there are some comments on this, that it was part of the global divide between Russia, China, and the US, where the US just sticks to Western hemisphere. So Russia is not going to interfere too much. So just showing, of course, they were disappointed when all this happens, because this is like the message to other Latin American countries. But in fact, it's not very much against, because it means in some kind of logic that now Russia is somehow able to catch more in their sphere of influence, while China will keep the Indo-Pacific region at the moment. So,
was it, just for the case of clarity, was this a deal, or was it just a proposal that Russia made to the US as trying to make it through unofficial channels?
It was not official. Still, there is a lot of rumor nowadays about this kind of not formal deal made in 2019. So probably there was there were some kind of negotiations, probably behind the official steps, and this is. I would say that there is some logical thinking in this, because now, after all this, what we observed last Saturday, and this capture of Nicolás Maduro, and also putting Venezuela in the exclusively in the Western Hemisphere as the sphere of American influence, will be kind of a good deal for Russia when Russia is going to focus now on their sphere of influence. So this kind of deal is possible, I believe, although we don't have any formal documentary on this.
No, we don't know what's going to happen. I mean, there is also the peace process, which is ongoing, and Donald Trump has authorized further sanctions against Russia, saying that he still believes in peace. He hopes he will not have to do them, but the bipartisan majority in Congress was given a green light to proceed with those. Now, critics of this operation say this is going to embolden the likes of Putin or Xi Jinping, that it will legitimize their actions. They will be able to say, oh, look, America did this in Venezuela. So, for example, Xi Jinping is going to look at Taiwan and say, well, we're doing something similar now.
So, these actions taken by the U.S. against Venezuelan leader are commented to be against the law, American law, international law. So this can also be a sign, a real sign for other global powers, great powers, to exercise their power and their control over other countries. Of course, it's not the same situation in other regions. Still, we can see that the great powers can do what they want if they really can. And it's not a good sign for other countries that the great powers are not going to follow the rules of international law. Probably these events in Venezuela will influence all other global politics next weeks, next years. So we will see global change of the sphere of influences and exercising the way of exercising their power, their control over other weaker countries.
If so, let me ask one final question. Of course, not all powers are made equal. The US has actually captured the Venezuela-linked oil tanker, even though Russia claimed to afford it protection. But let's go back to America's hemisphere approach. Do you think there are other countries on the list? Do you think that Cuba, for example, might experience some sort of political or military pressure, or worse?
So we heard a lot about Cuba, about Colombia, Mexico as being the next on the list. I believe that Cuba will not experience any kind of this military intervention next weeks, because Donald Trump believes it's a too weak country at the moment, I mean in economic sense, so that they don't need to intervene, in fact. I'm not sure about Colombia, I'm not sure about Mexico. Some kind of military threat will be exercised probably next weeks, and we will see some other actions. I'm not sure about military perspectives, but still some kind of actions, threats from the U.S. administration towards Latin American countries, that's for sure.
Joanna Gocłowska-Bolek was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight and expertise.
Thanks for inviting me.
And now we move on to the Eastern News Flash, a curated selection of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. Russian strikes on energy infrastructure have plunged parts of eastern Ukraine into a rapidly escalating humanitarian emergency, leaving major cities without heat, power or reliable communications during freezing winter conditions.
Following overnight attacks, the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia regions were left largely without power and heating, disrupting communications and air raid warning systems. Ukraine's Interior Minister Ihor Klimenko said police and emergency services were operating in reinforced mode, with loudspeakers used to warn residents where alerts were offline. Acting Energy Minister Artyom Nekrasov reported that around 800,000 households in the Dnipropetrovsk region remain without power and 8 mines were shut down. Authorities say Russia is deliberately targeting energy infrastructure to cripple industry, force displacement, and make eastern Ukraine increasingly unlivable.
Ukraine is turning to data-driven tools to accelerate humanitarian demining, as vast areas of liberated territory remain dangerous long after Russian forces have withdrawn.
Ukraine plans to deploy digital solutions to guide humanitarian demining in 2026, prioritizing the most at-risk agricultural land. A new digital platform presented by the National Mine Action Authority analyzes large data sets to identify where clearance is most urgent based on security risks and land use. In 2025 alone, demining units surveyed more than 490 square kilometers of farmland and cleared 367 square kilometers across 9 regions. Officials estimate mine contamination may affect up to 30% of Ukraine, highlighting the scale of the challenge as planning shifts towards technology-led prioritization.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news, updates and commentary.